Steve Jobs said, "Your work is going to fill a large part of your life, and the only way to be truly satisfied is to do what you believe is great work. And the only way to do great work is to love what you do. If you haven't found it yet, keep looking. Don't settle. As with all matters of the heart, you'll know when you find it."
Relentless, commonly defined as oppressively constant, determined, showing no abatement of severity, intensity, strength, or pace. I believe relentless is an ethos. You're not stopping until you get what you want. You're not taking no for an answer. No obstacle will deter you from your goals. Relentless mentality is where we get to tap into the mindset of change agents, leaders, and icons. My hope is that their stories will inspire and motivate others to transform their mentality in their profession, their personal life, and ultimately their communities. So remember, when it's tough, will you give up or will you be relentless?
Happy to have Michael Erath on the show today. He's the owner of Smart Direction and the Traction Hub.
Yep.
And, I don't know if I've ever told you this. Sometimes you meet people, and the first time you meet them, you just are kind of like, you click, and you just know something about this person. And the first time I met you, I remember I was at the Phoenician at a conference, and we started talking, and I'm like, something about this guy that we just hit it off.
Right.
And then we learned from other meetings that we both were in a family business.
Right.
We both had gone through some tough transitions within our family business. And I'm like, it's just interesting the way the world aligns people at certain times and certain places. So I was hoping you could just start by telling your story. Instead of doing the formal introduction, I think we'll get to your book and kind of the things you're doing today. But just telling your story and your background and how you came to Phoenix most recently and just moved, actually.
Saturday.
Last Saturday. So please.
Super. So I grew up in a family manufacturing business. I had been involved in that business through high school, working part-time, college, same thing. And we had, when I was 23, I'd just gotten out of college, we had sales offices in North Carolina. We were in the hardwood veneer business, so we supplied the furniture industry. So all of our sales were there. We had a manufacturing facility in Virginia, in Southwest Virginia, just outside of Roanoke. We had some management changes there, and my wife and I had just gotten married. We didn't have kids, so we weren't too tied to High Point, and we needed a family member to be at the manufacturing facility. So we decided to move, thought it'd be a temporary thing. But I really fell in love with the manufacturing element when I got involved in it, even really more so than sales. And so as I continued working in that business, my father was quite a bit older than I was. He was 44 when I was born. So he was, I got out of college, he was 65. He was transitioning into his early 70s, and his health started to fail him. So by my late 20s, I had taken over the manufacturing business. He had exited, and he kind of had 2 years of just a downward slide with his health before he passed. So his late 20s taking the business over, and we were at the time about 90% of our sales domestic in the U.S. So that was at the same time the furniture manufacturers started moving a lot of their facilities to Asia. So all of the customers that were right in our backyard, as I'm coming on and transitioning into the second generation of the business, were gone. And so we had to go through this transformation into more of an exporting business. And so I had to kind of reinvent the business at that time. Eventually transitioned to about 80% export over a number of years. And as we worked into 2006, 2007, the economy was good, housing was strong, our business was continuing to grow, and lots of our equipment was outdated, the facilities needed to be expanded, so I took the business through a CapEx project, put about $6 million in, and it was heavily leveraged at the time. Money was easy to come by at that time. Banks were pretty generous with it, and so the debt service, as we grew the business on that expansion, was fine. We added more production lines, upgraded equipment, and we had scaled the business. I'd scaled to about 18 million by 2008, 2007,
started
2008.
in like 7-8 million, I think, if I read your
Yeah, so we were $8 million when I took it over. So we went from 8 to 18 million. So as we ended 2007, starting into 2008, we were producing on 3 shifts. We had about 175 employees, and business was going very well. In November of 2008, our revenues fell to 400,000. And if you kind of, for those of you that remember the housing market collapse, it was like the spigot just turned off. And so that stayed kind of, that continued to be our norm for a while. And about 3 months into that, I started getting concerned in our lack of ability long-term to keep up with the debt service. And so I was worried about slipping into insolvency and starting to figure out what I needed to do to navigate that. Fortunately, at the same time, I had started a business back in '99 with a partner. It was a trading company, and same industry, but what we did in that company is we would buy hardwood logs, primarily from sawmills and landowners, and we bought some standing timber, but we would export those logs. And so we were supplying raw materials all over the world. We were sending, on average, about 150 containers a month of logs overseas. My partner and I had grown that to a $27 million business. For the last 3 or 4 years of that business, I had stepped out of the day-to-day and was focused on our family business. So that was kind of where I was going to go. If the family business, if that was not going to be viable going forward, I knew I could transition into this trading company, go back into the day-to-day of that, help my partner build and grow that. So as we continued into early 2009, it did become evident that I was not going to be able to sustain our family business. So I had started negotiations with our bank to go through an orderly liquidation and keep it out of bankruptcy. And had negotiated a window of time with them for about 18 months for me to navigate that process. Within about a month of starting down that road, I found out through my CFO that my business partner, who was also my best friend, I was his son's godfather, we vacationed together, we'd grown really, really close. Not only had he been embezzling, but he'd been committing bank fraud. Wow. So over the prior 2 years, he'd embezzled over $500,000. $27 million, it's kind of easy to hide if you're good. But he'd also been submitting falsified borrowing base certificates to a federally chartered bank. And he was doing that as revenues were starting to decrease in that business. So I ended up in a really difficult situation. I was actually driving to DC to a forum moderator training meeting. I was in YPO at the time, and I got the call from my CFO that he had discovered this and I needed to come back. So immediately called my attorney, ended up meeting him at his house that night together with my CFO, trying to figure out what the heck you do with this. This was completely uncharted territory. The next morning, we had engaged a former FBI forensic accountant who was now doing private investigations with white-collar crimes. He came in and spent about 2.5 days really pulling together what it looked like was going on to confirm what we had thought. At the end of that, it verified our suspicions and corroborated what we thought we knew. And so I fired my partner, and the next day we were at the U.S. Attorney's Office with boxes of documents that came out of that. The investigator was with us. We essentially went to them with what we had uncovered, and the next day after that went to the bank, gave them a rundown of what was going on as well.
So let me pause you there. So you have the turn of the economy, which hit most people at the recession, and in your family business, most of the domestic partners you had moved to Asia, and now you had a different business that had transitioned from your father and then hit the recession.
Correct.
And that business was not self-sustainable for some of those market dynamics that changed.
Right.
You had another business that was with your partner that was in the trading side of hardwood logs and other products. And that business at that time was growing until you found out that your partner had been embezzling money and creating falsified claims and so forth. So you had a perfect storm of two businesses, one that was your family's business and your other business that you were going to move into simultaneously blow up during the biggest recession.
Correct.
If that's not relentless and you're sitting here today, I don't know what is. Okay, so
I'm still here.
Okay.
So so I spent in essence, I leading into that had two businesses that were doing together about $45 million in revenue. Within about a 12-month period, everything was gone, completely wiped out. And
so at the time, what were you thinking?
Man, it was a very lost, confusing place to be. Ironically, and I talk about this in the book, my wife and I had, so we got married, we were 22 and 23 when we got married. We'd been dating since we were 15, and about a year before all of this transpired, we were going through a pretty difficult patch in our marriage and had actually separated for a little while. And one of the things that I learned and realized during that time is that during the years of success, I was starting to grow more narcissistic, and kind of my ego was building up beyond what I would have wanted or intended. And it was impacting our, excuse me, it was impacting our marriage, it was impacting our family, and causing some rifts between us. And so we had to go through kind of a reset in our marriage and kind of coming to terms with all of that. That happened literally, we came out of that about 6 months before all of this happened. And in hindsight, we really know that there's no way our family or marriage could have survived what was about to come had we not had a chance to go through that. So that was going on kind of in the personal life. And one of the things reasons I wrote about that is I see a lot of successful entrepreneurs that kind of get trapped by their successes, and it affects them in other areas of their life. So it's something I just wanted to be vulnerable about and talk to people about. Yeah. But I spent about 4 years working with the U.S. Attorney and with the Secret Service to help build the case against my former partner and best friend. They ended up indicting him. He pled guilty on 2 counts, spent 2 years in federal prison. All of this while I was going through the process of kind of rebuilding a new business and rebuilding my career.
Wow. So fast forward from there, you found that you wanted to do something different, which is where I've met you as the EOS implementation coach and facilitator. And so, can you talk about the transition to EOS?
Yeah. So I had started a new business in 2011. Stayed in the same industry, but moved to Columbus, Ohio. And it was much too capital intensive to rebuild a factory, and I was not at all up for that. But outside of Columbus, there was a contract manufacturer. And so I kept a few key employees. We continued to procure our own natural resources and do all of the sales and distribution. We outsourced the production. And so as I was building that, I had transitioned from YPO to EO. About 2 years into building that business, one of my EO colleagues introduced me to the book Traction. So I implemented that in my own business over about a 3-year period. And in doing that, my leadership team really came together, got clear on how to run the day-to-day, what the vision was, where we were going, and that freed me up from being so involved in the day-to-day. One of the things and it was interesting listening to Amy Brusky talking earlier, one of the things I realized going through the process was that as the owner, I was getting too deep in my own business, and I was actually creating a lot of the dysfunction and a lot of the friction and conflict. And so as I began to elevate from that, the team really started to gel and just did a better job of running the business the day-to-day. And so with that freedom, I started to recognize that I really had a passion for facilitation. I really enjoyed being in that environment and was really passionate about EOS and the value of systemizing your business. So I started to look at what it might look like if I transitioned into a role of becoming a coach and a facilitator. Yeah. So I made that leap in 2015, kind of decided to burn the boats and go 100% all in with that. It's been a fantastic journey because it really aligns much more with what I've discovered my purpose to be in the second half of my life.
So Michael's book is called Rise, and the reason I started off the podcast with him telling his story is because I read quite a bit, specifically in the space of entrepreneurship, and a lot of folks in my circle, both my staff and friends, I've told to read this. This is a book you cannot put down. He told a little bit about the story and the trials and tribulations he's gone through, but it's absolutely incredible. And so the reason I wanted to have you on is really to kind of, people go through difficult times.
Right.
And I really was hoping you could share some of your mindset. You talked about having a difficult time with your wife, having a difficult time with not only the businesses, but you were dealing with multiple systems, including the federal government and so forth. And so, can you just talk about what got you through that? What really was the catalyst for you to maintain through that time period? And now you've built another successful business and continue to grow that business as well, which we can get to in a second.
Yeah, on one side, fear is a hell of a motivator.
Yeah.
And so there was a lot of fear at the time that I think kept me pushing forward and trying to find a way forward. But I've always believed that no matter how difficult things are, they do happen for a reason. We go through things in life for a reason and to set us up for something else. And there's a great Steve Jobs quote that I use in the book that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect the dots looking backwards. And you have to trust that the dots will align. Yeah. And so that was kind of where my head was through a lot of this, and I know I could not have gotten through it. I'm to this day incredibly thankful for my wife. She was an absolute anchor in our family and really the gel that helped keep us together. We were moving. Our oldest son was just going into high school, and we were bouncing all over the place, losing a home and moving from Virginia to West Virginia to Columbus, Ohio, and just a lot of turmoil. So that was a big part of it. But I just kept really trying to focus on why is this happening to me? Why am I going through this? And what am I going to do with it?
Yeah. What advice would you give to people who may be going through hardships themselves right now in their business or their personal life where that intersection is so close and tied together?
You know, one thing I realized looking back at this is that, and a good friend of mine, Jonathan Smith, writes about this in a book he calls Optimized for Growth. He talks about how every entrepreneur needs three things. They need a system, they need a coach, and they need a peer group. And so if you think about that as kind of the three legs that you need, right?
System, coach, peer group.
Yes.
Okay.
And so for me, having a peer group, and it wasn't just my entrepreneurial peer group, but also part of my passion for facilitation had come through leading some couple small groups and some things through our church. So I had a good network of people who saw me for more than just a successful entrepreneur or somebody that, you know, we had a plane and would go on golf trips, things like that. It was more of a personal connection. And so having people like that I could just be willing to be vulnerable and open with, that was helpful because it gave me a network of people to support me. So I think that's one of the things to really understand is when you're going through hardships, it's really easy, especially for entrepreneurs, to feel like you're on an island and you're isolated, that you're really not. And if you can just be open and vulnerable with people, people do care and they're there for you. You've just got to be willing to see that not as something that makes you look weak, but as just a part of the human condition and part of the path that we all go on.
Yeah. So on that three-legged stool, who was your coach? Who was your mentor?
So I had a couple. So, you know, it was interesting. Even though he had passed, there was a lot of my dad that came back to me, a lot of things I remembered, things he taught me, things he told me. My mother even was really involved in my life at that time, and so she was very helpful. I leaned on a handful of my YPO colleagues because I was still in YPO at the time. A couple of my form mates were really great through that process.
Okay. So would you say, you know, not only the mindset, but your work ethic, you've built, you know, it sounds like four businesses
Yes.
at this point. So in terms of the work ethic and hours and putting in to make these transitions, can you talk a little bit about that too as part of kind of your mindset going through, especially that transition with your partner? I mean, you had to put in extra hours, not only to build the new business, which you moved to Columbus, it sounds like, but also you're still dealing with the backlash from him and some of those actions. So,
you know, and I'm sorry, ask the first part of that question.
So your work ethic, you know, you talked a little bit about the mindset behind dealing with the fear and all these kind of things hitting you at one time. That's part of it, but the second part of it is also having the work ethic to work through that and actually accomplish. You built a new business, it sounded like, in Columbus in 2011.
Right.
But you also were still having to deal with your partner and kind of closing that.
Right, yeah, he was not indicted until 2013, so all of that was going on at the same time. So it was a big distraction, but I think there were a couple of aspects to that. Part of it was survival mode. It was just, you know, you're either going to figure it out and get through it or you're going to quit. And it just wasn't in my nature to give up. I had way too much to fight for. Our kids were young and at an impressionable age. And so that was a lot of the push through, but also I grew up, my father grew up very poor in Chicago and was really a self-made man. My mother had also grown up poor, and I had just observed over years watching my father work, and he worked very hard, but he worked very smart. And so he wasn't one of these 60-hour, 70-hour a week kind of guys, but he did work hard. He worked very smart, and so that resonated with me a lot as I was going through the transition. So it was a little bit of survival, and I think a little bit of conditioning from having been exposed to him and just remembering how he was.
Okay. So let's switch gears a little bit to EOS and the Entrepreneurial Operating System. I obviously know what it is, but can you explain a little bit more about that, how it touched you, and what it actually does for businesses?
Yeah, so it's really at a high level about helping entrepreneurs live their ideal life. And what I found, there's a book called Profit First, you may or may not have read,
okay.
But there's a story in that I think really resonates with a lot of entrepreneurs. And what the author talks about is, if you think about Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein,
Okay.
you had Dr. Frankenstein who really did something miraculous. He created life where there was no life, and so he created something out of nothing. A lot of entrepreneurs do exactly the same thing. And what Dr. Frankenstein found was, over time, that creation morphed into a monster that was hell-bent on destroying him. And how many entrepreneurs do you know who end up in a situation where what they've created is actually destroying them, right? And so I had been through that, obviously, numerous times. And so what I started to realize as I went through this implementation in my own business is that really breaking through the complexity and trying to simplify things in your business and focus on the true foundational things that are the root cause issues of all the symptoms we deal with and suffer through, there's great power in that. And so as I was going through this, what I was finding was that so much of what I was dealing with weren't really issues, they were symptoms. And there were only a few issues that really existed. We just never got down to the root cause of our issues. I say that thinking about a client I used to work with who was a dentist, and he really was interested in caring for the whole person. One of the things he talked with a lot of his patients about was how diabetes manifests itself in a lot of oral issues, gum diseases and different things. And he would often talk to patients about coming in for problems with their gums, but that was going to continue to plague them until they dealt with their diabetes. And so he really would steer them toward deal with the underlying problem, stop focusing on just dealing with the symptoms. And it's the same thing in our businesses. We tend to feel a pain point somewhere, so we try to address that, but the actual root of that pain is elsewhere. And we just never get there, never see it. And so that's really one of the things that comes out of this system, is focusing on really getting open and honest, getting to the root cause of your issues and solving them so they go away forever. One of the other really interesting pieces of what comes about with the EOS, which I think you've seen and experienced, is this focus on team health. And there's not a lot of that in the systems in the business world that's out there. There's so much focus on how can we be smarter, how can we have better data, how can we hire smarter people, but there's a reluctance to focus on building healthier, more open and honest teams. And that's a big part of what we do in this process is really call out the elephants, deal with them, and build healthier, more cohesive teams.
Sure. So you made the leap of faith after the other three businesses you had, and came to Phoenix in 2015.
So I started working out here, in late 2015.
Okay. And now you coach and implement for other businesses the Entrepreneurial Operating System, EOS. And so within that, what has been the biggest aha moment for you with working with other entrepreneurs using EOS, or the moment when you're like, you know what, I really know this is what I'm supposed to do?
For me, it was really when I was getting into this and I was starting to actually see the impact that the really open and honest conversations were having on people and helping them start to transform not only their businesses, but how that spilled over into transforming their lives, especially for the entrepreneurs and the founders and the leadership team members. It started to help me realize that as I kind of look back to connect my own dots, that my purpose really now is to take everything that life's given me over these 20 plus years in the entrepreneurial world and all of the challenges and struggles I've been through, and I now have a platform to share that openly and honestly with people and help kind of give back by sharing that with them.
How many clients do you have for EOS?
34 on Monday, because I've got a potential client who I know is going to close.
Awesome. So 34 businesses. You obviously work with us, and I've seen what you call your dojo expand dramatically, and it's an awesome space. So and now you're doing something a little different too with the Traction Hub. Can you talk a little bit about that and how that is a little bit above and beyond the initial scope of what you were doing for EOS?
Yeah, absolutely. So where I'm going with this concept of the Traction Hub is there's so much limitation on my capacity to help other people, and there are lots of companies out in the community who are self-implementing EOS. They either can't afford a full-time coach, they haven't scaled to that point yet.
Or they're a knucklehead like me who thinks they know how to do it at first, and then they realize they don't know what they're doing, and they need to bring somebody like you in.
Well, you said that, not me, but thank you. But what I've started to realize is that a lot of these self-implementing companies, they just need some guidance that they're not getting. And so my vision for Traction Hub is to create somewhat of an alliance of companies that we will meet quarterly and just have a day where we collaborate and learn from one another that I would facilitate and host to help them get questions answered, to help them solve issues, and just to keep them kind of on the rails with regards to using the system the way it was intended, because most entrepreneurs like to tinker with things, and we've talked about this before, that entrepreneurs are typically very creative, they're very visionary, and so when you get this prepackaged system that works really well across a multitude of industries, there's still this tendency to mess with it and try different things. And so what happens is people tend to devalue what they could be getting out of the system, thinking that they're doing things good in a good way. And so with the Traction Hub, I think I can help them get more value out of what they're doing and continue to transform their businesses in a better way. So it's a way to reach more people, really.
And so you're also working with the process optimizer using Heidi as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that is huge for entrepreneurs, especially like myself. You know, that is putting together the process and the details and the data and documenting that, I think, is one of the hardest things to do. So can you talk about how you guys help people with that too?
Absolutely. So one of the biggest things I see, and the longer I do this, the more accurate I see it to be, is that of all the things we focus on in our business, it's really people and process, right? And so with process, one of the things that a lot of organizations struggle with is either finding the time to really take to document their processes, to optimize them, to solve for all the broken handoffs and all the breakdowns in their process, and get that documented, shared, and trained with everyone in the organization. So it tends to get delayed, but there's tons of value in getting that done. And so as I was working with clients and trying to get them doing that, the majority of my clients were delaying because they didn't want to spend the time. They weren't sold on the value, and they didn't have anybody who was really evangelical about process in the company to drive it and push it. And so there was this kind of idea that was born out of it. A good friend of mine, Heidi Berger, was a former executive at P.F. Chang. She's a lean expert, and she and I had a conversation over dinner one night about what I was experiencing with my clients, and we talked about how we could maybe build some sort of a really intense workshop where we could help companies get their processes done and documented so they could start getting value and training on those in a very short amount of time. So we created what's called the Process Optimizer. There is a website, processoptimizer.biz, that we now have put this out on. And what we do is Heidi will come in, and we're actually going to start training other facilitators to do this, which will come in and spend about 2 days with a client on site, working with various teams within the company and actually mapping all of their processes in just a really intense workshop. At the end of that, she takes all that data, creates what we call their franchise prototype, or essentially their process documentation of all of their core processes. And then we return that to them to do the final edits on and to start implementing into their business.
Sure. Well, we could talk all day.
Sure.
We talk too much, I think, as it is. Sometimes I take up too much of your time. So the last lightning round of questions. So I always ask people 3 closing questions. So who inspires you?
Really, it goes back to my father. He's been really inspirational. He's been gone now 15 years. He still inspires me. And I've gotten a lot of inspiration lately from an author named Greg McKeown, who wrote the book Essentialism. That book has been transformational to me because it's very easy as an entrepreneur to get pulled in a lot of different directions, and your time just continues to get chipped away at. One of the biggest takeaways I got is that no is a complete sentence, and getting really good at saying no to things that don't absolutely align with why you exist and what you want out of your life.
Okay. What motivates you now?
Motivation really is I think a real, it's not even a passion, but I almost think of it as a burden for entrepreneurs that I see either going down a path where they're setting themselves up to be in the same type position I was if we have another bad economic downturn, or where they're so focused on accumulating things that and growing their reputation and to the point that it's detrimental to their family. I feel almost a burden for that, and so that really really motivates and inspires me.
Okay. What are you the most proud of?
What am I the most proud of? I'm probably the most proud of discovering why I'm here and feeling like I can now do something that fulfills that. Even when I was working in our family business, that was not really what I felt aligned with my purpose. It was a job. It was a way to earn income and to take care of my family and to continue a legacy. But I was really trapped in that rat race of just growing a business, and I wasn't clear on why I was here. And I really feel like I'm crystal clear on that now, and I'm starting to realign my life towards that. There's a really impactful story about Alexander the Great that I'll kind of leave you with. I'm not sure if you've heard this or not, but Alexander the Great, on his deathbed, had 3 wishes, and he had fallen ill on a trip. Yeah. It was one of his conquests, and he just wanted to get back to his mother and see her and kind of bid her farewell before he died. And on the journey back, he realized he was not going to make it. And so he called his generals together, and he asked them to grant 3 wishes when he died. And he wanted them to execute this without fail. And so what he asked them is, he said, I want my doctors and my doctors alone to carry my coffin. And on the way to the graveyard, I want the path to be strewn with my coins, my gold, my jewels. And he said, I want my hands to hang out of the coffin and swing freely as you carry me to the graveyard. And so one of his generals came over in tears and kind of pressed his hand to his heart and said, absolutely, we'll do this for you, but why do you want us to do these odd things? And Alexander the Great told him, he said, I want the doctors to carry my coffin because despite all of my wealth and all of the physicians that I have access to, they absolutely have no power over death. They cannot cure anything. They cannot cure anybody. He wanted all of his riches to be strewn on the trail to remind people that the chasing and accumulation of wealth for the sake of wealth is a waste of the time that we have on this earth. That if you aren't going to share that, you can't do anything with it, you're going to leave without it. And then the last, with his hands out of the coffin, was to remind the world that we come into this world empty-handed, and that's how we leave this world. And that the only thing we really truly have is the time that we're given from when we're born until when we die. And that if we don't treat that as the most precious thing we have, then we failed. And I think that really resonated with me also, because I'm beginning to realize as I think I'm approaching or entering the second half of my life, that I have a finite amount of time, and I want to do something that I feel like fulfills my purpose.
Yeah, that's deep. Thank you for sharing that.
Absolutely.
So Michael, how can anyone that watched the podcast today get a hold of you?
Probably the best way is my email address is michael@smart-direction.biz, or the website smart-direction.biz. There's a contact form there. Contact information is in my book as well. That's on Amazon. You can search Rise Michael Erath and it'll come up.
Awesome. Amen. Thank you so much.
Brother,
Enjoyed it. Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed what you saw today, please subscribe in the links below. And remember, never to quit, always be relentless.